Okay, so we are the part of this program where the course is starting up with frameworks. Okay, and frameworks, the okay, so yeah, we are part of we are in the topic with frameworks. Okay, and we have introduction to frameworks. The two prerequisites of application development frameworks, namely the HTML and SQL, is what we covered in the previous sessions. And in this session, we'll start with the introduction to the frameworks and the rest of the topics. Okay. So you're able to see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, with frameworks, what are the common frameworks we have in open source framework? The Flask web development framework is the first one, which is based on it's a Python based web application framework. And a framework represents a collection of libraries or the modules that enable web application development in order to build applications without having to bother about the ground level or low level details. Okay, so there are a set of modules available in the name of Flask. Okay, and this is a library. We'll look at that first. Okay, and there are also other application development frameworks. So Django is another high-level Python-based web application framework, which encourages clean development, clean, rapid development, and the design is pragmatic. It's followed by the model view template architecture. Okay, so both these frameworks are open source frameworks in that they are a library which you can use inside your Python development environment. Except they have different origins. Okay, Flask originated way around 2005, whereas Django way later, and they are supported by separate team of developers, separate team of open source developers. Okay, now why do we need a framework? You can build your own web applications with HTML, and you could have your own web server and so on. But the need for a framework is because the application has low-level functions, which the framework makes it easy to do. Okay, and we'll see how. Low-level functions in terms of the interacting of the web application with the users and the interaction between the web application with the server in terms of the core functions it does. Okay, the core functions it does, like showing a page, things like that. Okay, so Flask is one framework and Django is the second framework. We will be looking at Flask framework during this program. Okay, Django itself is a separate framework which is offered as another. It's not a part of this program. Okay, it's offered as another program. Okay, another course. Okay, now Flask goes with this logo. Yeah, web application framework. It's I think the icon of a horn. And it goes by this slogan like web development one drop at a time. Now, here is some background of the Flask framework. Flask is a web application framework written in Python. It's written in Python, and Flask is built with a WSGI toolkit called WorkZui and Jinja 2 templates. Now, these names are new. This is the origin of Flask. Now, what is a WSGI toolkit? WSGI toolkit stands for WSGI, pronounced WSGI. Okay, and actually, it's the name WorkZui and Web Service Gateway Interface. It stands for Web Service Gateway Interface, which means it's a gateway to the web server. It's an interface which forms a gateway to the web server. Okay, it's allowing the web request to be served through this gateway. Okay, so and it has been adopted as a standard for Python web application development. Python web application developers can use this toolkit, okay, to through which the web request will be served. Okay, the web server gateway interface is an interface which takes up your web request and serves the response, and it's built on Python standards. Okay, now an interface between an application and the server. We'll see what. Okay, we'll see shortly. So the gateway WSGI interface is an interface between the application and the server. Okay, and Flask uses a simple web application server, which has got two flavors. Okay, now when you see there is a simple web application service. Basically, when you build application, the developer uses an IDE and it, in the process builds the various screens, okay, and the functionality. Okay, so what the web application developer requires is basically a web server. So in Flask, Armin Ronacher, the founder of Flask, has built this Python module, okay, built this Python module and packed the web server inside the Flask library. Okay, inside the web library, he has put a development server. So why? Because when you looked at this around 2005, basically when an application developer, all he needs is to sit somewhere, build with his own laptop, without having to install another web server somewhere. Typically in an organization, the web server would be installed in some hardware, in the hardware inside the organization. Or if you have to build in these lines, there is a web server running inside the organization, and most often the web server is handled by a system administrator or a web administrator. Okay, so then the developer has to go about interacting, finding where that resource of the web server is, and then go about building his application, which can be using the details of that web server. Now, instead, Armin Ronacher, the founder, thought, okay, it'd be a very good idea if I can pack a development server and make it available for the developer as a simple development server. And that's exactly what he did with the Flask application web server. Okay, so he has packed a web server for development purpose. Now, when I said there are two flavors, so the development server will be available to you, okay, for deploying your applications. Let's say you developed a school, student system, and it has to be deployed. So there is a simple development web server available to you to test your application and run. Okay. However, that development server is for building and developing your application, it is not ready for production use. So for production use, Unicorn, G unicorn, a green unicorn, as it is written here. Green unicorn, short for Unicorn, is available to be installed as a production ready server. Okay, to be installed as a production ready server. Now this server can serve static files. Now what does a web server do in terms of the architecture? Let's take a quick look here. Okay, now you probably might have come across this, but here is your client browser. Okay, now this represents the client browser. We are seeing the application architecture. So the client or the end user sends a HTTP request to the server and gets a HTTP response back. Now web server here is Nginx. Web server here is this machine where it's a server hardware, of course, but this machine is what's running the production web server, or typically a web server. Now, what does a web server do? It takes a request from the client, okay, and in the web server or in the server is your application installed. Okay, you might have created a student application or a library applications or some banking application. So that's running on the server, and the web server takes that request, and then it might have some data which it is required to pull. That data is sitting in some database. Okay, and here is a couple of database options like SQLite database, Postgres SQL database. The request can be fetching information from this database. What is the student record? Okay, what is my banking account information? So things like this, or what are the books I have borrowed, okay, from the library. So this information is data, and so the application sends a request to the database and then gets that data. Now it has to present it as a web page response, right? And that response goes back through to the client as a web page. Okay, so web page itself is built in the application here, right? The built in the application, the web page would be like allowing a login page or a student information page or things like that, or marks page and things like that, or enrollment of all the students into some course. The result goes as a HTTP response as a web page back to the client. But in between the web server and the client user, there is this web service gateway interface. Okay, now this is what Flask uses as a development server available in Flask. The Flask takes that request and passes it to the web server. So that's a server software. It's a software layer called Flask between the request and the response from the web server. So web server gateway interface acts as an interface to the user and as a gateway to the web server. Okay, so it's a gateway interface. So web server gateway interface called WSGI. Now, what is this? Is a piece of software running. Okay, now in a production environment, meaning in real-time deployment, it could have a production server, not a development server. Okay, so that's this green unicorn. And that production server is capable of handling simply higher loads. It has multi-threading. It has capabilities to launch multiple worker requests for certain operations. So it is simply called a production server. Okay. However, in the development purpose, we will not be using this production server. For building and testing the web application, we have a Flask development server packed into this Flask library. Okay, so the developer need not run behind the system administrator and hey, get my server ready. I have to build one development. I have to develop one banking application. I have to develop a student application. Okay, so he need not run behind the system administrator or the web administrator. Instead, Flask has packed and given that development server right for the developer so that he can sit in all by himself and build the application, test it on a development server, and pretty much be able to build the application without having a dependency of a production server. Okay, so that is the architecture. Okay, so Flask here is a WSGI web server gateway interface, and it also packs for development purpose a Flask server. Okay, and when the student or when the developer has finished building the application, then later for production purpose in the open, you can deploy it with another server called Gernicon, which is a production server. Okay. Now, what is this part called Nginx? Now, Nginx stands, it's basically one component running in the web server, which hides the request of the user. Okay, I mean, basically hide the request comes from the user, but Nginx is for reverse proxies. Now that might be something new for you. This again goes in a production deployment. Okay, now what is this? What purpose does a reverse proxy serve? Is like when you finally deploy your banking application on the server, user sends a request and then the response comes back. But user will typically know the IP address of the server. User can know the IP address. The IP address would be in the URL. But if you leave that approach of exposing where the server might be, okay, in terms of that four numbers of the IP address, this user request can be interpreted by some hacker, okay, and the hacker can hack into the system knowing where the server is. So in order to hide this server IP address, server's location from directly being intercepted by a hacker, we have what's called reverse proxy. So when a reverse proxy is deployed and configured and deployed, this will allow to hide that location, hide that IP address of the location of the server. Thereby, the hacker cannot hack. Hacker will just see some name only without the actual location of this server. So it doesn't expose this server for any attack. Okay, so that's the job of Nginx, which is a reverse proxy. Okay, so I think that information is sufficient. So when the request comes here, nobody can know where the server is. Typically, a hacker can take that request and mimic with another machine saying that this is my server. So your request is going to the hacker's server instead of going to the production web server. Okay, thereby the hacker can take your information. Okay, he might even take your username, password, things like that. When the request may be having some HTTP request of the account number, which is going through the GET request, he can break in and hack. Okay, so in production deployments, we have Nginx, which hides and it's called the reverse proxy. Okay, thereby server is secure. Okay, it's a matter of security. But in a typical application development, you don't have all these. Okay, you use a Flask library inside your IDE, and you're all set to use the functions of this web service gateway interface. Like we'll see what functions. The functions could be like how to redirect to a certain page, how to send the request which comes in from the HTTP from the user to a certain page, and then send the response back. So simply it takes this request, processes that request. It might even fetch the data if that page is having a database records to be shown, and we combine everything and send it back as a HTTP response. So Flask does that job. Okay. Is this understood, Shriram?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any questions? You feel free to ask. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So now we've seen here a web service gateway toolkit called WorkZig. Okay, this is all going to be once you install the Flask library, and it's quite simple. Okay, and then it uses Jinja 2 templates. Now, what is this template? This is a Jinja 2 templates allow you to show information in HTML pages. Okay, so we'll see the details, but for now, think that the screens which you're going to be showing in our HTML sessions, we built some forms